Hey folks, we're getting into some good stuff today, especially if you're a fan of extremely challenging titles. See, thanks to the folks at Game Critics, I was able to get a review copy of Nano Apostle, developed by indie game studio 18 Light Games Limited. This title combines stylish action and light bullet hell elements in a series of brutal boss fights. But that's not all though, since I also happen to receive a review copy of Garten Fiend Games' Perennial Order, a Souls-inspired boss battler with an emphasis on exploration, co-op, and a very distinct level of difficulty. Of the instant death variety. Either way, they're both quite the doozies, which begs the question: did these titles manage to cultivate a series of beautifully balanced boss battles, or could these best be defined as nanoseconds of nightmarish nonsense? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Starting with Nano Apostle. In the depths of a secret research facility, a small child rouses to consciousness, unsure of where or even who she is, or how she found herself bound to the sentient nanite weapon known as the Apostle.
Nanomachine, son.
See? Title drop? Title drop. The only thing certain is that things will only become worse in time because she's slated for a series of deadly experiments in the form of live testing against techno-organic war machines. Thankfully, she's not without reprieve as she finds herself being protected by the mysterious Wenny, an AI who seems keen on helping the girl survive. But for how long? So yeah, it's a pretty horrific scenario all in all, and one that I found the game did a decent job of portraying by providing small character-driven scenes in between each of its major boss fights. While they aren't overly lengthy, they do a good job of progressing the narrative, and I'll admit that while it was minute, the additional bits of dialogue you can get from talking to Wenny can be pretty funny. That said, what really captured my attention was the small flashback cutscenes that crop up at the end of each boss fight, as they provide small slices of backstory which seem tangentially related to the story at first, but which click together rather neatly by the end of things. Especially if you've been poking at the computer terminal in the hub, because not only does it let you revisit earlier flashbacks, it also contains a slowly growing number of lore documents which contextualize everything. It actually makes the why of the story a lot more horrible once you take everything into account. So yeah, I think as far as narratives go, Nano Apostle does a great job providing a relatively bite-sized story to navigate and a fairly satisfying conclusion at the end of it all. It's just reaching it as something else entirely, because Nano Apostle is unrepentantly hard given that it revolves around a series of tightly focused boss battles with a high level of lethality, to the point that's fairly normal for a boss to carve through your health in a few concentrated hits. Now, in total, there's 6 experiments to face off against, each of which provide distinct attack patterns you'll need to learn, whether it's navigating different projectile arrays, figuring out the timing for melee combos, or identifying and adapting to the unique mechanics specific to those encounters. Patterns, I should note, which tend to change up as the fight progresses, given every encounter has multiple phases, which organically build on the mechanics of the preceding one. For instance, the initial boss narrows the scope of the arena during its second phase, which makes avoiding its newly prolonged combo strings trickier, especially since it also gains the ability to set chunks of the ground on fire. And that's just the tip of the iceberg insofar as what Nano Apostle will throw at you. Thankfully, the game isn't entirely remorseless. The iframes it grants on hits are fairly generous, which, in tandem with healing items provided for each fight, allows for a number of mistakes to be made before a given boss fight is completely scuffed. It's just, those mistakes are probably going to happen. The game is trying to kick your teeth in. Nonetheless, I found the experience fairly intuitive to pick up and play, because at its core, Nano Apostle's combat system is both solid and simple. For instance, while the basic attack does chip damage, it pops out quickly, chains nicely, and avoids overcommitting, which allows it to pair nicely with the dodge command. Especially since the iframes on dodge are extremely generous, with the only real limitation being a slight cooldown and an allergy to large-scale AoEs. Which is nice and all, but it lacks a certain je ne sais quoi. Which is why for the risk takers in the audience, there's the parry. Now, while the timing is notably tighter than its more evasive peer, this was the option I leaned on for the crux of the game for a few notable reasons. First off, unless an attack is red, you can parry it, so there's quite a bit you can no-sell and then attack through. Second off, parryable projectiles can be returned to sender, which is funny in and of itself, but this also leads to perk number 3. Destructible points. While they're only revealed for a few sparse moments, hitting a boss during this juncture will do a chunk of damage. While bosses may occasionally reveal destructible points on their own after an attack, more often than not the best way to trigger them, parrying certain attacks, especially if you want to trigger a number of them in short order. Because, well, it's not just the upfront damage that makes them valuable, but the fact that triggering them repeatedly will stagger a boss. And boy, is staggering a boss satisfying, because not only do they just collapse and let you beat on them for a bit, they also become vulnerable to your grappling hook, letting you fling yourself at their face with all the murderous zeal of a drop bear. Which is not only more free damage, but also extends the boss's designated punching bag time. Oh, and while I've gone on a tangent, this isn't even all the reasons why learning to parry was a major plus. The final reason is the simple fact that it does wonders for building gauge, the resource needed to use the projectile attack. Now at a glance, the damage it doesn't really seem all that impressive by default, but as I progressed through the game, I couldn't help but realize how incredibly useful it is. First off, there's a certain degree of utility in being able to trigger its destructible point after a boss has somehow flung themselves to the other end of the arena. That said, what actually led me to liking it was the fact that ranged attacks inflict the infected status, which builds up as you attack the enemy. Once it's fully charged, it bursts to deal a decent bit of damage and leech some health, providing a solid alternative to the otherwise limited healing item the girl brings with her. In fact, there were more than a few times where the bulk of my healing in a given round could entirely be traced to maintaining infected stacks on an enemy. And even that isn't the full extent of what the gun can do, since it can also be used to hack traps, converting them to your side for all sorts of nastiness. Like making a boss run into their own bear trap for a good laugh. Frankly, its sheer flexibility makes the final unlockable ability, the charge attack, feel a bit underwhelming. But only by comparison. After all, not only does it hit hard and have a decent radius, the charge attack can also parry when it clashes with an attack, and if it lands that first hit, you're granted a secondary charge you can unleash whenever. Altogether, it's a neat kit that provides a lot of options, and by extension lends itself to a number of different playstyles. Especially once the module system is factored in, because boy, does that have some neat elements to play with. See, modules are passive skills which change up how the protagonist plays, such as the initial module that modifies the grappling hook to briefly boost combo damage after it's used. That said, as bosses are cleared, a growing array of alternatives are unlocked. For instance, there's a skill module which allows a charged attack to inflict infection, which pairs neatly with a module that lets ranged attacks be charged to deal 2 infected stacks, and another module which allows infection to be immediately activated by a light attack if there's 3 existing stacks. With just 3 skill modules, a combat strategy already begins to take form, and that isn't even the extent of synergistic strategies that can be cooked up. See, each module also has a number of specific types associated with them, ranging from things like tactical assault, polymerized power, extremist traits, and others besides. While this helps to give a general sense of what the module is geared towards, it also means that a set bonus is provided when a number of matching modules are slotted in. While these boosts start out relatively subtle, they can be stacked up to 4 times, and the capstone for each type tends to be fairly significant, which can make choosing modules for their type alone a tantalizing prospect when it intersects with multiple types. It's just, there's some rather distinct limitations that need to be worked around. First off, there's only so many skill slots that can be played with, starting at 2 and capping out at 7 by the end of the game. Secondly, the majority of modules require skill points to be activated, with only a few granted for free by the story. Admittedly, this isn't as damning as locking you into a route, since you can freely refund points. Rather, it's a means of controlling the overall value of the modules that you can slot into your skills, and thus providing some incentive to pursue the challenge content. Which, On the easier side of things, there's the training environments, which provide a small array of optional stages divided between lethal obstacle courses and minor enemy-laden combat stages. In both cases, the point is to clear them as quickly as possible for up to 3 skill points a pop, and 18 by the time you've cleared all of them. That said, the largest source of skill points is from the boss battles themselves, as each one has 10 separate challenges to engage with, which can be as simple as clearing it quickly enough to as challenging as doing so without being hit. There's also a number tied to the mechanics of the stage itself, which serves as additional incentive to learn the ins and outs of the fight proper. Thankfully, the bulk of them can be earned fairly organically to the point that fueling a fully fleshed out skill set comes naturally. So only completionists will be obliged to engage with the more masochistic tasks, which I am slightly guilty of. But yeah, that's the mechanics. As for the visuals, I really felt that Nano Apostle killed it. There's some absolutely great sprite work at play here, with some delightfully animated bosses to go up against, and some absolutely brutal executions to witness. Like, I was caught off guard the first time one happened, and simultaneously fascinated by the simple detail that the Apostle turns the girl away and obscures her vision from the heinous amount of violence happening. And those animations aren't just limited to the fights either. While the game certainly has a smaller scope insofar as its cast and area, they're provided with some nice animations as the story progresses. Also, by extension, the visual novel segments that crop up are also fairly well done. But if there's something else I'm going to gush about, it's going to be the music. I absolutely adored the boss themes in this game, full stop. The tracks bring a lot of oomph to each of the encounters, helping to make each one just a bit more memorable, and also injecting a bit more life into the moments spent outside of the combat arena. So what I'm ultimately trying to say here is, I really liked Nano Apostle. While I wasn't initially keyed into the story, the manner in which it played out and the tidbits of backstory it provided really served to pique my curiosity and provided yet another reason to push forward. Because, well, there were more than a few moments where I got punted around. Despite only having 6 major bosses, it took me 7 hours and change to reach the end of the game. And sure, some of it was because I've been pursuing challenges for skill points or self-satisfaction. I perfected the first boss. But other moments were just, I'm pretty sure the last encounter kicked my head in for an hour and a half, at the very least. So yeah, like I said earlier, the game is challenging, and it expects you to rise to meet it, and I respect it for doing so. There were so many times where I found myself poking into a battle, not to win, but to study the mechanics, to learn the timing for certain attacks, and to figure out what I'd need to do for a successful run, or to experiment with different builds. In fact, the one that I created for my final successful run changed up my playstyle substantially, since it nerfed the cooldown of my dodge, penalized me for spamming it, and disabled my healing by turning into an attack buff. Essentially, it all but obliged me to master the parry, which I then doubled down on by adding a module that cranked my attack after parries, ultimately amping my basic attack to heinous degrees. And the fact that it let me do all of that, as well as a number of silly, gimmicky builds, amazing. To the point that even after I'd finished the story, I doubled back to mop up a few extra challenges and further fine-tune my capacity for violence. It's satisfying to the point that I'd be remiss to call it anything other than a crit hit. Just, again, if you're diving into it, mind the difficulty curve. Regardless though, this brings us to the second title of the day, Perennial Order, which places you in the role of a perennial knight. Admittedly, this is a bit less dignified than it sounds, considering that translates to amnesiac plant entwined skeleton regurgitated from the guts of the earth. Still, it does come with its perks, such as peerless regeneration that allows you to revive from mere scraps back to a state of, whatever passes for hale and hearty for whatever you are. Which is a good thing, given you've been tasked by a mysterious voice to purge the lands of the pestilent horrors haunting them. All of which are able to handily rend you to pieces in the span of a heartbeat. Yes, that's right, every time you die in this game, it is absolutely canon. In any case, while that certainly does a decent job of summing up how your quest begins and your overarching objective, there's a fair bit more to be discerned if you're so inclined to snoop around. See, while you certainly earn tidbits of information from simply advancing from one boss battle to the next, most of the game's lore is optional. Now, a lot of it's accessible enough, whether it's background details NPCs share when pressed, or simply some dialogue they offer after a certain boss is defeated, given there's quite a bit to soak in, which helps to further flesh out the world of the game, and to turn some of your triumphant boss encounters into tragedies. That said, for those seeking more, there are points of interest scattered throughout the game's various areas, some of which are fairly hidden. While the details they provide are generally fairly brief, there are some neat tidbits to be gleaned from these. Though, if I had to pick my favorite source of juicy story details, it'd be the researcher, if only because they can accept the tokens left behind by bosses and exchange them for documents relevant to the encounter. That's right, they aren't just a brief boss write-up, they tend to be a couple pages of writing which help to further build the world while being rooted in your recent triumph. Reading them was always a bit of a treat and made returning to town feel rewarding. So yeah, I'm rather fond of the story, and also, before I forget, there is a pair of endings to uncover, but they both hinge on a final decision at the end of the journey, and choosing one doesn't lock you out of the other, so you're wholly able to check out both of them if you so desire. While they're both fairly short, they do feel rather fitting as far as conclusions go, though I wholeheartedly prefer the more stubborn of the two options. Still, as much as Perennial Order provides a unique world to soak in, what kept me occupied the most was the gameplay, if only by dint of the sheer amount of deaths I tallied up over the course of my playthrough. Because when I say this game is hard, I was not exaggerating. Which is funny, since in and of itself, it's a title that's fairly easy to pick up and play, what with your initial loadout being a swiping attack you freely aim and a narrow heavy attack which requires charging and can crit when released correctly. Well, that and a dodge, which is limited by your wisps, 3 by default, and the time it takes for those to recharge. Rather, the difficulty lies in the premise, that being a Souls-like boss battler which sees you share the same structural integrity as a piece of paper caught in the middle of a deluge. Suffice to say, it is a tactical consideration that makes things harrowing and outright nightmarish for the more involved encounters, especially when you consider that each of the game's boss fights are vastly different experiences. While some of these variances fall within the normal range, being able to be summed up as new movesets to learn, others are far more complicated, obliging you to actively figure out how to even make a boss vulnerable, or adding new mechanics specific to those encounters. You can't tell me this boss here isn't an Ikaruga flavored nightmare and a half. And do not even get me started on this bridge camping jackass. Suffice to say, learning the ins and outs of these encounters is an intricate process, especially given the relative sparsity of your dodges and the time it takes for them to replenish, which makes the risk of being caught out very real, especially if you overestimate your windows of opportunity and get overly aggressive. The lack of enemy health bars hardly help either, as the inability to discern just how close a boss was to dying or even how much progress I was making taught me to be cautious, possibly overly so. Really, the best indicator I had was whenever the bosses went through one of their phase changes, and those were more of a cause for concern than anything else, given it frequently entailed the pace of the battle picking up while a handful of new patterns slipped into the mix. Quite frankly, the stress of potentially messing up while dealing with all those unknowns contributed to a fair share of flubs. To the point that I cannot help but express my gratitude at both the overall brevity of the death screens and the sheer generosity of those checkpoints, since I was never far from whoever killed me. Or whatever did, given that the world of Perennial Order is fairly hostile to the unwary. There's nothing quite like wandering through a forest only to get grappled by a murderous plant, skewered by spikes, or other fun flora, especially when that area is a fairly broad landscape and you're denied any form of fast travel. I mean, yes, there are shortcuts you uncover along the way, but there's quite a few that are one way, which means if you forgot or overlooked something deep in one area, backtracking can feel like a bit of a hassle. Doubly so in co-op, since a second player can mess with the way the camera's facing, a hazard which also applies to the boss fights, which I had to contend with for the entirety of my playthrough since I was playing with Alzarath. Small aside though, thank you Alzarath for accompanying me on this long journey. It was a hilarious comedy of errors as we figured out each encounter and took turns absolutely making a mess of things. Also, for the sheer zeal in which you helped me abuse the co-op only feature, the Vestiges, which are basically active abilities that your co-op player can trigger when they die during a fight, allowing them to contribute to the encounter rather than kicking around for a few minutes watching helplessly. Well, okay, there is a passive vestige which kills both players when one dies in exchange for faster wisp cooldowns, but given how often we died, we only used that during a certain Caligulus boss fight, since its whole gimmick is it wipes the entire fight. Well, okay, there were a couple times Alzarath was flicking it around out of curiosity because, fun fact, vestiges are shared. There's no mixing and matching. So yeah, him just tweaking it on resulted in a couple wipes here and there too. But yeah, if you're hoping for mixing and matching, that particular bit of customization is the sole purview of Instincts, Perennial Order's module skill system, and a major factor in why I scoured the game as hard as I did, since while you certainly receive thematically appropriate skills from beating the game's bosses, there's also a decent number scattered about the world or granted by certain NPCs. And they vary immensely, from passive skills that boost maximum wisp count, make your dodge deal damage, or alter your damage while at high or low wisp counts. You also have more active options as well, such as a dash slash, a dodge that turns you into an invulnerable cloud, or a parry, though the bulk of these do spend wisps much in the same way as a dodge would, which certainly factors into their tactical viability for a given fight. And really, that's the beauty of it all. Throughout the playthrough, both myself and Alzarath found ourselves repeatedly switching around our instinct loadout in order to find out what worked well at countering a certain boss, or complementing our respective approaches to the game within the confines of our skill point / memory cap. Something which our ability to respect at any point made extremely accessible. It also meant that whenever we stumbled on and completed one of the myriad optional obstacle courses and earned the bonus memory at the end, which are basically your skill points, we'd wind up having a miniature theory crafting jam where we tried to figure out how much nonsense we could now cram into our loadouts. So, simply put, instincts are super neat, though I'll confess that there were more than a few times that I wish they could play out a bit more synergistically. For instance, there's an instinct that stacks infection on an enemy and bursts it when hit by a charged attack, but only the player with the ability can trigger it, which super sucks if that player dies. There's also some collectible power-ups you can find that increase the skill damage of your normal attack, but doesn't necessarily apply to all of the vestige skills. But really, those are some pretty small nitpicks in the greater scheme of things, and I certainly can't fault the game for the plethora of other options it provides, including the means of thoroughly customizing new playthroughs after you've cleared the game. And it also tosses in a boss rush mode that you can tinker around with, either to go toe-to-toe with individual bosses, custom rosters, or just all of them. It's legitimately neat, and I certainly admit that there were more than a few times I considered doing so just by merit of its enemy design, because Perennial Order is gorgeous, full stop. The world that it offers to players is one which vacillates freely between serenity and grotesque weirdness, and a few splashes of nightmare fuel for good measures. It makes exploring each area a lot of fun, given the detail into making them distinct. And I absolutely adore the character design for this game. The townsfolk are just so varied. Like the wandering botanist, who's unique, and this fellow, who's totally not Hollow Knight. As for the bosses, I can't help but appreciate how rewarding it was to study the enemies, given the clear effort in providing them tells, even if some veer towards the short side of things. Though even without that element, the fights were still visually rewarding given the bosses are a hell of a spectacle. There's some really elaborate designs to encounter along the way, and it was always neat to find out what I'd be squaring off against next. Something which is definitely helped by the game's soundtrack. It does a solid job of setting the mood, and I couldn't help but appreciate that every area and encounter had its own theme. It's just plain good. And veering back towards the gameplay side of things, I found the game was fairly generous in providing verbal cues for a number of bosses, which helped a great deal in preempting certain attacks, looking at you, Oak Devil and Master of Bloom. Still, when I step back and really think about my experiences, what can I say? Well, narratively, I was intrigued early on, as the story offered solid bits of world building and some scintillating mysteries to latch onto, which meant what was going to make or break the experience for me was the gameplay. And while I certainly acknowledge that it is an extraordinarily difficult game at times and rather frustrating when it wants to be, it's simultaneously one that is rewarding. There was this rush, a feeling of accomplishment that accompanied taking down a boss because of how little room for error each encounter allowed. I couldn't cheat those fights through shenanigans, which made every victory feel earned. And I can only express praise to the game due to the sheer variety it managed to offer over the course of 14 boss encounters, because they don't ever feel like they're retreading old ground, with even the phase changes in a boss fight serving as a significant change of pace. It's very, very good, and made me all the more appreciative of the instinct system, because while some of the options are straight buffs, like dodges doing damage or extra range on your attack, the stipulations attached to others serve to change up how I could approach a problem. Admittedly, I do feel a bit more mixed about the exploration elements, because while I always enjoyed my initial run through an area, scouring its corner in search of secrets and the occasional challenge course, the lack of fast travel and the overall expansiveness of the hub and other areas meant getting from one end of the map did feel like a bit of a slog. Sure, there's a dash you get late game, but you control more sluggishly while you do so, and again, if you're playing in co-op, the screen gets a little finicky. And it really doesn't help that there isn't a map for any area beyond the hub, so if you passed over something earlier, like say, a guarded door you didn't have an answer to, it's not like you can leave any sort of marker to remind yourself of where it was, beyond manually searching everything and leaving yourself sticky notes. So, if your memory is potatoes like mine, expect a bit of aimless meandering and probably hugging some walls looking for secret passages, or the aforementioned sticky notes. Ultimately though, this didn't break the experience for me. At the end of the day, I still came away from Perennial Order feeling satisfied from the experience. Yes, there are undoubtedly moments where I felt my patience eroding, but the experience was still fair. There were always tells I could learn or tactics I could make use of in order to progress along. There was a continual sense of growth and learning throughout the experience. Also, I should note, while I largely played the game in co-op, it wasn't always an advantage, because the game boosts enemy health with the expectation that both players are pulling their weight. So it can actually make things harder if someone happens to die very early on. Doubly so if a player drags enemy tracking over to you and messes up your dodge. Though inversely, the vestiges do a fair bit of work towards evening up those odds, and there's some pretty devastating options there. Comparatively, when I poked around the boss rush mode solo, well, I still died a heap, but when I did get my successful run done, it was a lot faster than my successful co-op encounter. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is Perennial Order is a hit for me. It's a legitimately solid boss battler that provides a very different brand of difficulty compared to a title like Nano Apostle, and I can legitimately recommend giving it a try, provided its difficulty doesn't dissuade you. And again, it is very interesting for something that you can pick up and enjoy on your own, but that you can also rope a friend into for a very different experience. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, feel free to leave a comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie game reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. And check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Andy noted. Also, if you want neat swag like a Crit Hit shirt or a coffee mug like the ones I have, you can check out my merch link. There is a link to the description as well, and it all helps to support me and get food for my cats. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.